In the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppes, empires rose and fell like the tide, but none left a mark quite like the Xiongnu, originally called Hunnu, and no leader was as feared or revered as Modu Chanyu. For 3 decades, he ruled with an iron fist from Mongolia and beyond, forging a nomadic superpower that would challenge even mighty China. Then, at the height of his power, Modu vanished without a trace. No body, no tomb, no explanation. How does the most powerful man in the steppes simply disappear? And what secrets did he take with him? Let's find out.
This documentary presents historical events based on extensive research and available evidence. While Khan's Den always strives for accuracy, interpretations of history may vary.
So to understand the mystery of Modu's disappearance, we must first grasp the world he inhabited. The year is 209 BC, and the steppes are a cauldron of competing tribes and nascent empires. To the south lies the newly unified, albeit short-lived, Qin dynasty of China, a looming threat to the nomadic way of life from Lake Baikal to the Altai Mountains. The Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples, had long been a thorn in China's side, but they didn't always used to be united. Composed of various tribes with their own ambitions and rivalries, the Xiongnu were more of a loose alliance than a true empire. That is, until Modu stepped in. Modu's ascent to power is a tale that would make even the most hardened steppe warrior flinch. Born into the Luandi dynastic clan, and as a direct crown prince, his path to leadership was far from assured. His father, known as Tümen and called Teoman by the Turks, had other plans. In a move that speaks volumes about the brutal politics of the time, Tümen sent young Modu as a hostage to the rival Eurasian tribe. It was a political gambit, yes, but also a convenient way to rid himself of an unwanted heir, of someone who was at least as skilled as himself, but perhaps more popular and certainly younger. Dangerously popular and dangerously ambitious. Tümen then attacked the Eurasian with an army, fully expecting them to kill his son in retaliation. But Modu, showing the cunning that would define his rule, managed to steal a horse and escape back to his people. Rather than punishing his father for this betrayal, Modu bided his time. In turn, Tümen was also very impressed. Thus, the son gained his father's trust and was put in command of a force of 10,000 horsemen. It was here that Modu implemented one of his most infamous and effective policies: absolute obedience. He crafted special whistling arrows and trained his men to shoot at whatever target his arrow struck. To test their loyalty, he fired at his favorite horse. Those who hesitated were executed. Next, he shot his favorite wife. Again, those who hesitated met a swift end. Finally, in a move that sealed his reputation for ruthlessness, he fired at his father's prized stallion. When his now terrified troops followed suit without hesitation, Modu knew he had forged a force of absolute loyalty. In 209 BC, during a hunt, Modu turned his whistling arrow towards his father. His troops, conditioned to obey without question, loosed their arrows. Tümen fell, and Modu seized power. He quickly eliminated his stepmother, his half-brother, and other rival leaders who opposed him. With internal opposition crushed, Modu turned his attention to expansion. He subjugated neighboring tribes, including the Mongolic Donghu to the east and the Yuezhi to the west, the very people to whom he had once been a hostage. Under his leadership, the Xiongnu transformed from a loose confederation into a centralized empire, stretching from Manchuria to the Pamir Mountains. Modu's rise was as meteoric as it was brutal. In just a few short years, he had gone from disposable prince to the undisputed master of the steppes. But as he would soon discover, building an empire was one thing, keeping it was another matter entirely. And the greatest challenge to his newfound power lay not in the steppes this time, but to the south, where the new Han dynasty of China was watching the rise of this nomadic superpower with growing alarm. Modu was the Chanyu, supreme ruler over the Xiongnu tribes, ruling with an iron fist but greatly rewarding his followers for success. Modu's name has been translated into Maotun by the Chinese and into Metehan, which is how he is known by name in Turkey. However, both are translation errors. His original name, as was recorded in the earliest Chinese sources, was not Modu, Maotun or Mete, but Bagatur, hero, in Old Turkic and Mongolic, a honorific title that may have been bestowed upon him by his loyal followers after his successful rise to power. Perhaps Bagatur was his actual, personal first name already upon his birth. But who were the Xiongnu themselves, the rest of the group? Their origins remain shrouded in mystery. Some scholars link them to the Turkic peoples, others to the Mongolic peoples, and some even suggest a connection to the Huns of Attila, who would much later invade Europe and the Caucasus. What we do know for certain is that the Xiongnu were master horsemen, skilled archers and fierce warriors. They used hit-and-run tactics just like the other Turkic and Mongolic empires would be known for later, but they were also capable of besieging cities with a little bit of foreign help. The Chinese sources in the 6th and 7th centuries linked the Turkic Ashina clan, dynasty of the Göktürk empires, to the Xiongnu. And here on Khan's Den, we are certain of a Turkic identity of the Xiongnu, at least of their Turkic-speaking elites, who ruled over a Mongolia that, back then, was mainly inhabited by Turkic and even Eastern Scythian, but barely any Mongolic peoples. Check out our documentary about the Xiongnu Empire if you want to find out more in detail by clicking on the icon in the upper right corner. In the subsequent decades, with the Xiongnu unified under his rule, Bagatur transformed his confederation into a true empire through military innovation and cunning diplomacy. He implemented the decimal system in his army, dividing forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000. A system later adopted by the Ruran, Göktürks and the Mongols of Genghis Khan. This organization, combined with the absolute loyalty of his troops, made the Xiongnu a formidable force. Bagatur's diplomatic skills were equally impressive. In 200 BC, he trapped the Han Emperor Gaozu at Baideng, but instead of eliminating his rival, he negotiated a quote-unquote peace treaty that established the Hekin system. This arrangement forced the Han Chinese to send regular gifts of silk, grain, and even Han princesses as brides for Xiongnu nobles. A humiliation for China, but a triumph for Bagatur. Under his leadership, Xiongnu territory expanded dramatically, stretching from Manchuria to the Pamir Mountains, from Siberia to the Great Wall. His near annihilation of the Eurasian even prompted the latter to flee from Eastern Central Asia entirely, taking refuge in Western Central Asia and eventually creating the Kushan Empire of Eurasian or Taharian origin. The Xiongnu's conquests were like a domino effect upon Eurasian history. Bagatur's main interest was keeping his power, and therefore he balanced the interests of various tribes, managed the complex tribute system with China, and defended against external threats and internal rebellions through a mix of brutality and generosity. There's no clear defined good guy or bad guy in the story, but someone who is eager to be the best out of all, a primus inter pares. As Bagatur's reign progressed, his reputation grew to near mythic proportions. To his people, he was the Chengli Modu Chanyu, as the Chinese once recorded. And this is obviously a corrupted title, with its original meanings lost in translation. In original Old Turkic, the full title is supposed to be Tengri Kutlu Tanju, the emperor blessed by Tengri above. Tengri being the supreme ruler of the sky and prime deity of the eponymous Tengrism belief system. The divine legitimation, which occurred in Ötöken, the mythical forest city, which would also become the main capital of the Ruran and the Göktürk empires, was certainly nothing strange to the Chinese, whose own emperors used similar titles as Sons of Heaven. Still, to the Chinese, Bagatur was, at the end of the day, a barbarian king of terrifying power. But as the son of Tengri approached his 60th year on Earth, at the height of his power and with no clear challenger in sight, he became something else entirely, an enigma whose final fate would perplex subsequent generations, because one day he simply vanished. The details surrounding his vanishing are frustratingly scarce. Chinese chronicles, our primary source for this period, offer little more than a terse statement that Chanyu was simply no more. He died. No mention of a battle, no record of illness, no hint of internal strife. In 174 BC, Modu Chanyu or Bagatul died. Of old age perhaps? Well, unlikely. Despite the hardships of steppe life, people did manage to live well beyond their 50s in this part of the world. Maybe he was wounded and/or got ill, either on the battlefield as a commander or even at home. Then again, the most powerful man in the steppe certainly had his fair share of calm, of shamans as they were originally called in Turkic, who knew very well how to treat wounds and such. Further, no special disease making its rounds through Mongolian plains has been recorded for that time period either. It's as if the most powerful man in Central Asia simply ceased to exist. What we do know only deepens the mystery. There was no period of mourning recorded, no grand funeral befitting a ruler of Bagatul's stature. His son, Jiyu, assumed the title of Chanyu with an alacrity that raised eyebrows even among the hardened power brokers of the steppes. More puzzling still is the lack of reaction from the Han court. For a ruler who had been the bane of China's existence for decades, Bagatul's disappearance seems to have elicited little more than a diplomatic shrug. No celebrations, no shift in policy, no attempt to exploit what should have been a moment of weakness for their greatest rivals. Certainly, there's always the possibility that this event was either not recorded because it wasn't deemed important by the writers, or that such a record did exist, but was lost over the course of the time span that is now more than 2000 years. The first theory is very unlikely, as the death of a great ruler always causes great mourning among his people and often a shift of foreign policy among his former adversaries and allies. The second theory isn't completely out of the question, but still seems unlikely. Our main sources, recorded in China from 200 BC onwards, are in that regard complete. Thus, we can rule out the missing source theory too. This must have been a deliberate omission, perhaps a calculated erasure of history, or did something occur that was so unexpected, so outside the realm of normal politics that even the careful chroniclers of the Han were left speechless? What really happened to Bagatul, the emperor of the steppe? The vanishment of Bagatul Chanyu allowed for numerous theories that we will now gloss over. 1. The assassination theory. Bagatul was assassinated by someone from within the Xiongnu state. His son Jiyu's swift ascension to power suggests a possible coup. Just as Bagatul did to his father Tumen, his own son might have repeated the deed on Bagatul himself. This would be very ironic, but if so, why the secrecy? In the brutal world of ancient politics, assassinations were hardly uncommon, neither in sedentary societies like Greece, Persia and China, nor in the steppes of Eurasia. Perhaps the method was so shocking or dishonorable that it had to be concealed. This theory is, in any case, the most plausible explanation in my own estimation. If Bagatul was, for example, so power-driven, and he certainly was, and did not allow for the next generation to take over before his death as an old man, it is only logical for this very new generation to take matters into their own hands. Literally. Remember that the Xiongnu were from top to bottom, from east to west, a militarized society. 2. The voluntary abdication. This theory posits that Bagatul, sensing his declining health or mental faculties, chose to step down voluntarily. This was not unheard of in nomadic societies where leadership demanded physical and mental prowess. But in this case, one would expect some sort of affirmation by his people. The problem is, as so often with the Xiongnu, that they did not leave behind their own history in written form. So maybe they did acknowledge Bagato's retreat, but simply never recorded it. Then, why the lack of ceremony or official acknowledgement from the Chinese archenemies? 3. The Chinese abduction. A more conspiracy-minded theory suggests that Bagator was secretly captured by the Han Dynasty's agents, perhaps during a diplomatic meeting gone wrong. This could explain China's muted reaction, but it's hard to imagine how they could have pulled off such a feat without it becoming known. Furthermore, this would have caused massive backlash by the Xiongnu tribes. Dishonorable diplomacy was a taboo in the steppes, and despite some tribal chiefs and kings breaking with it, during the Xiongnu era, certain norms were adhered to at all times. 4. The supernatural explanation. So in ancient Turkic mythology, great leaders were often said to have been directly sent or at least appointed by Tengri to rule. This was also applied to basically every Chanyu of the unified Xiongnu Empire. Sometimes these rulers were said to ascend back to the heavens after they had achieved their goals, becoming one with Tengri. Could Bagato's disappearance have been framed as such a mythical event, camouflaging Bagato's death, whether by disease, wounds or even an assassination, in order to appease the many tribes of the Xiongnu Empire? 5. The strategic deception. Perhaps Bagato's disappearance was a fabrication, a strategic ploy to confuse enemies or test the loyalty of subordinates. This might explain the lack of reaction from both the Xiongnu and the Han if both were aware of the deception. Coming back to our pragmatic approach, archaeological evidence about any remains has been frustratingly scarce. No real tomb of Bagato has ever been identified, though numerous kurgans, the burial mounds from the period, have been excavated. If the golden Isaac man from last time, 18 years of age, whether male or female, but likely merely of princely status, was given such a great burial, you would expect the great Bagato to have been given at least as much attention by his own kin, who, in the end, benefited immensely from his rule. Comparative historical analysis also offers some intriguing parallels. The disappearance of Bagator bears some resemblance to the vanishing of other legendary rulers like the mythical Sumerian king Gilgamesh or the British king Arthur. Of course, these figures were certainly mythical, and Bagator, in a way, is also mythical. In each case, the absence of a definitive end to their reign allowed their legends to grow, perhaps serving a political or cultural purpose. And Bagator's legend, as real as he was as a mortal being, was fostered many centuries after the Xiongnu had been no more. For example, among the 24 Turkic tribes who, after the definitive fall of the Göktürk rule in 750, settled near the Aral Sea in Central Asia, Bagator's legend lived on in the form of Oğuz Khan or Oghuz Khan. This figure is thought of as the ancestor of all these 24 tribes, as the common father who founded the state named after him, Oghuz Yapgu. Normally, the title Yapgu was used for the chairman of the federation who was democratically elected, interestingly. But since Khan had a divine connotation by now, just like Chanyu, the Turks to this day speak of the great Oğuz Khan. The G in time became silent. Legend has it that he basically shared the same biography as Bagator or Modu Chanyu from 900 years earlier. Oğuz Khan's story seems like a copy and paste of Modu Chanyu from Mongolia, which prompted generations of Oğuz Turks to think that Modu or Bagator did not die but lived on, perhaps in spirit, to gift the Oğuz Turks a new home, safe from the never-ending wars in Asia in a stable geographical environment. It is the Oğuz Yapgu state from which later many Turkish empires emerged, and thus the Turkish rulers from Central Asia to Anatolia, from the Volga River to the Near East, saw themselves as descendants of Bagator, the supreme ruler of the Xiongnu. So what really happened to Bagator then? Assassination? Voluntary exile? Divine ascension? We may never know. And admittedly, we really don't. But this is a fun thought experiment in my opinion. Besides, his Vanishing act did leave an impact on steppe history, shaping Xiongnu politics and especially Turkic legends for centuries to come. You'd think that with a figure as larger than life as Bogator, someone would have spilled the beans by now, but the steppes keep their secrets well. Speaking of secrets, our next stop in this series takes us to a small clan of metalworkers who somehow ended up ruling half of Asia. Intrigued? Tune in next time as we dig into the Ashina clan's rise to power and the birth of the Göktürk Khaganate. Trust me, it's gonna be a wild ride.